Philadelphia, July 1936, and Vincent Carlucci was halfway up the rear stairs of a brownstone on Fitzwater Street when the wooden step beneath him gave way. He was carrying 75 pounds of ice on his shoulder, the tongs already biting into the block, when his right boot went through the rotten plank and his knee buckled. For a moment he hung there, one leg trapped, the ice still balanced, his body twisted at an angle that would have broken most men. He didn't drop the ice. The housewife at the top of the stairs, a woman he'd been delivering to for 6 years, watched him pull himself free, reset his grip, and finish the climb without a word. She never asked if he was hurt. He never said. He placed the block in her icebox, collected his nickel, and went back down to the truck. By the end of that day, Vincent Carlucci had delivered ice to 43 more homes. This was not unusual. This was the job. And within 10 years, it would be gone.
Before the hum of the refrigerator became the background noise of American life, there was a different sound in the morning. The clatter of iron-shod wheels on cobblestone. The creak of a wooden wagon turning the corner. The muffled thud of ice blocks being shifted in sawdust. That sound meant the Iceman was coming. In the first 3 decades of the 20th century, the Iceman was as regular as the mailman and more essential than the milkman. He came twice a week in winter, 3 times in summer, sometimes more if the heat held. He knew which families bought 25 pounds and which bought 50. He knew who left the side door open and who kept the icebox on the back porch. He had a route, and the route had a rhythm. The rhythm began before dawn. In cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit, and Boston, ice depots operated out of massive warehouses built along rail lines and riversides. These were not quiet places. At 4 in the morning, the floors were slick with meltwater, and men worked under yellow bulbs hauling 300-pound blocks from storage rooms kept just above freezing. The blocks had been cut from frozen lakes in Minnesota and Maine the previous winter, packed in sawdust and shipped south by rail, or they had been manufactured in refrigeration plants that ran around the clock. By 5:30, the wagons were loaded. Each Iceman received his manifest, a handwritten list of customers and their usual orders. The horses knew the route as well as the men did. In some neighborhoods, the horse would stop at the right house without being told. The Iceman's day was a loop through 10 blocks, 20 blocks, sometimes more. He moved through alleys and side streets, rarely using the front door because the back entrance was faster and it kept the melting ice from dripping through the parlor. It kept him out of the way, but it also kept him visible. Children followed the wagons in summer waiting for the chips. When the Iceman used his pick to score a block, or when a chunk broke free during the cut, he would toss the pieces into the street, and the kids would fight over them, sucking on the ice until their lips went numb. It was the closest thing to a gift most of them received without asking.
Housewives scheduled their mornings around the delivery. The icebox had to be emptied, and the drip pan had to be checked. If the pan overflowed, the linoleum warped. If the ice melted too fast, the milk soured. If the Iceman came late, dinner was at risk. The card in the window told him what to bring. It was a simple system, a square card with 4 numbers printed on the edges: 25, 50, 75, 100. You turned it so the number you wanted faced up. If no card was showing, he passed by. But the card was only part of the language. An Iceman learned to read a household by what he saw when he walked up the steps. If the kitchen smelled like yeast, the family was baking, and that meant they'd need more ice tomorrow. If laundry hung on the line out back, they were home. If the shades were drawn past 9 in the morning, someone was sick or someone had died. He didn't ask, he just adjusted.
In 1920, more than 60% of American households in urban areas depended on ice delivery, and by 1925 that number had risen. The Iceman was not a luxury, he was infrastructure. He was also a target. Route theft was common. A new driver would move into a neighborhood and start undercutting prices by a penny per pound, leaving cards on porches and offering to deliver on Sundays. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the housewives stayed loyal, not out of charity, but out of reliability. A cheap iceman who showed up late was worse than no iceman at all. The companies knew this. The large distributors, the ones who controlled the depots and the rail contracts, enforced their territories with muscle. If an independent driver tried to work a block that belonged to City Ice or Consumers Ice, his horse might go lame or his wagon might lose a wheel. There were no police reports. There were only routes that stayed where they were.
The Iceman didn't complain. He had a route, and the route had value. As long as the households kept the card in the window, he had a living. But the rhythm was hard. The work required a specific kind of body, broad shoulders, strong legs, hands that could grip a pair of tongs for 8 hours without cramping. The tongs themselves weighed several pounds, and the ice weighed more. 50 pounds was manageable, 75 was standard. 100 pounds required balance and a tolerance for pain that most men didn't have. And it had to be done fast. If you moved slow, the ice melted. If the ice melted, the customer complained. If the customer complained, you lost the route. Speed was survival. So the Icemen developed a walk that was half glide, half lurch, a gait designed to minimize jostling and maximize momentum. They learned to carry the block high on one shoulder, with the tongs hooked just deep enough to hold, but not so deep that the ice cracked. They learned to take stairs 2 at a time without looking down. They learned not to stop. By 1928, the average Iceman delivered to 80 homes in a single day. That meant 80 flights of stairs, 80 iceboxes, 80 back doors. If he worked 6 days a week, that was 480 deliveries, nearly 25,000 pounds of ice. And the wages reflected the work. In major cities, an Iceman could make $30 to $40 a week during peak season. That was more than a factory worker, more than a clerk. It was enough to rent an apartment, feed a family, and save a little for winter when the routes slowed down. But the money came with a cost, and the cost was written on the body. What did that body feel like after a decade on the route? What did it sound like when the knees gave out in the middle of a staircase? We're about to find out. Let's talk about the ice itself. Not as a commodity or a product, but as a physical thing that had to be moved by hand from one place to another, hour after hour, day after day. A 50-pound block of ice is roughly the size of a cinder block. It's clear if it came from a lake, cloudy if it came from a plant. It's cold enough to burn bare skin and wet enough to soak through canvas gloves in under an hour. And it doesn't stay 50 pounds. The moment it leaves the depot, it begins to melt. By the time it reaches the customer, it's lighter, but you don't feel the difference. You feel the fatigue. The tongs were the only tool. They looked simple, 2 curved steel hooks attached to a wooden or metal handle. You positioned them near the top edge of the block, squeezed the handle, and lifted. The hooks bit into the ice. If you positioned them wrong, the block slipped. If you squeezed too hard, the ice cracked. If the tongs were dull, they didn't grip at all. Most icemen carried 2 pairs, one for small blocks and one for large. The tongs hung from a leather strap on the side of the wagon, and the sound they made when they clanged together was part of the neighborhood soundtrack. It meant he was close. The other tool was the pick, a long steel spike with a wooden handle, used to score and split blocks when a customer ordered a partial load. You had to know where to hit, because ice has a grain just like wood. Strike it along the grain and it splits clean. Strike it across and it shatters. Shattered ice was wasted ice, and wasted ice was wasted money. But the real tool was the shoulder. Every iceman had a side, right or left, and whichever shoulder he used for the first delivery of his career became the shoulder he used for the rest of his working life. The other shoulder stayed clean. The working shoulder developed a callus, thick, leathery, permanent. The shirt fabric over that shoulder wore out faster. The muscle beneath it grew denser, and the pain was constant. Not sharp, not sudden, just there. A dull ache that started in the morning and deepened through the afternoon. By evening, it radiated down the arm and into the ribs. Some men wrapped their shoulders in wool, some used leather pads, and some just let the callus build until they couldn't feel it anymore. The knees went next. Stairs were the enemy, not the climb, but the descent. Carrying weight downstairs puts 3 times the pressure on the kneecap as carrying it upstairs. The icemen felt it first as a clicking sound, then as stiffness in the morning, then as a sharp, grinding pain that made them pause on the landing. There was no workman's compensation and no health insurance. If your knee gave out, you worked through it or you lost the route. Some men wrapped their legs in strips of cloth soaked in liniment. Some took aspirin until their stomachs bled. Some just slowed down and hoped the customers didn't notice. But the customers always noticed. A slow iceman was a problem. The ice melted in the truck while he limped up the stairs. The housewife had to wait, and the next delivery was late. The complaints stacked up, and eventually the company replaced him. There was always a younger man, always someone stronger, always someone who didn't limp yet. The horses suffered too. The wagons were heavy even when empty, and loaded with a half-ton of ice, they became rolling anchors. The horses pulled them up hills, over trolley tracks, through mud and snow and summer heat. In cities, the streets were paved with cobblestone or brick, surfaces that were hard on hooves. A lame horse meant a lost day. A dead horse meant debt.
So the icemen took care of them. They knew the flat routes, and they knew where to water them. They knew which streets had the worst potholes. The horses became partners. Some of them worked the same route for a decade. They recognized the stops, and they knew when to pause and when to move. They knew the sound of the tongs being hung back on the strap, and when the horse died, the iceman mourned. But there was no time for mourning. There was only the next day, the next block, the next flight of stairs. By the late 1920s, the physical toll of the job had become undeniable. Union organizers began pushing for weight limits. They wanted a maximum of 50 pounds per delivery. The companies refused. 50 pounds wasn't enough. Customers wanted more. If you limited the weight, you doubled the trips. If you doubled the trips, you doubled the cost. The organizers pushed back. They pointed to the injury rates. They pointed to the men who couldn't work past 45. They pointed to the widows whose husbands had died from hernias and heart attacks. The companies didn't care, because the system worked. The ice got delivered, the money got made, and when a man broke down, there was another man behind him. That's how it had always been. But something was changing. Not in the bodies of the icemen, not in the weight of the blocks, not in the rhythm of the routes. In the kitchens, in the homes, in the quiet hum of a machine that didn't need a man with tongs and a strong back. What happens when the customer doesn't need you anymore? What happens when the card stops appearing in the window? In the mid-1920s, a new sound began to hum in wealthy American kitchens. It wasn't loud, and it was easy to ignore at first. Just a low, steady drone that started when you plugged the unit in and didn't stop until you unplugged it. The monitor-top refrigerator. General Electric introduced it in 1927. It was a steel cabinet about 5 feet tall, with a rounded compressor unit sitting on top like a helmet. It didn't need ice, it didn't need a drip pan, and it didn't need a man to carry anything up the stairs. It needed electricity. And in 1927, 70% of urban American homes had electricity. The price was steep, $250. That was 8 months of rent for most working families. But for middle-class households, the ones with steady incomes and savings accounts, it was affordable. And more than that, it was modern. The advertisements didn't talk about convenience. They talked about science, about hygiene, about progress. They showed women in clean white kitchens standing next to gleaming steel boxes. No more melted ice pooling on the floor. No more sour milk. No more waiting for the iceman. The message was clear. This was better. The icemen saw the threat immediately. At first, it was just a few houses. A refrigerator would appear in a kitchen on a wealthy block, and the card would stop showing in the window. The iceman would make a note. 1 less delivery. The route adjusted. But then another house, and another. By 1929, Monitor Top had sold 75,000 units. Frigidaire, Kelvinator, and Norge were all producing their own models, and the prices started to drop. $200, $175, $150. The companies that controlled the ice routes tried to respond. They ran their own advertisements emphasizing cost. A 100-pound block of ice cost 30 cents and lasted 3 days. A refrigerator cost $10 a year in electricity and required repairs. They emphasized reliability. Ice didn't break down. Ice didn't need a mechanic. But the argument was already lost, because the refrigerator wasn't just about keeping food cold. It was about status. It was about being the kind of household that didn't need a man to come to the back door twice a week. It was about being modern in a country that was obsessed with modernity. And modernity was electric. The Depression slowed things down. When the stock market collapsed in 1929, discretionary spending vanished. Refrigerator sales dropped and factories cut production. The icemen thought they had been given a reprieve, and they had for a while. But the Depression also changed the way people thought about money. When you're rationing every dollar, you look for long-term savings. A refrigerator was expensive up front, but over 5 years, it was cheaper than ice. The math was simple. Families started saving. They started planning. And by the mid-1930s, they started buying again. In 1935, General Electric sold more than 200,000 refrigerators. By 1937, that number had doubled. By 1940, more than half of American households had electric refrigeration. The routes began to collapse, not all at once, not in a single season, but steadily, inevitably. An iceman who had delivered to 100 homes in 1930 was delivering to 70 by 1935. By 1938, it was 50. By 1940, it was 30. The companies started consolidating. Smaller depots closed, and the rail contracts dried up. The men who had worked the same route for 20 years were told there wasn't enough business to justify a full-time driver. They were offered part-time hours, half wages, no benefits. Some took it, some didn't. The ones who didn't had to find something else. But what do you do when your only skill is carrying ice? You can't retrain a 45-year-old man with bad knees and a wrecked shoulder to work a factory line. You can't teach him to sell insurance or keep books. The body that had been an asset for 2 decades had become a liability. Some of them tried to go independent. They bought their own trucks and they undercut the big companies. They went door to door, offering lower prices, weekend deliveries, personal service. It didn't work because the problem wasn't the price and the problem wasn't the service. The problem was that people didn't want ice anymore.
By 1941, the Iceman had become a relic. Not gone, not yet. There were still neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, rural areas, places where electricity hadn't reached or couldn't be afforded, where the wagon still came around. But even in those places, the writing was on the wall. The Second World War finished it. When the war started, the government redirected steel production to tanks and ships. Refrigeration manufacturing slowed but didn't stop because the demand was too high. And when the soldiers came home in 1945, the housing boom brought electricity to every new suburb. The refrigerator became standard, not a luxury, not an option, standard. And the Iceman became a memory. But what did that transition feel like for the men who lived it? What does it sound like when your livelihood disappears, not because you failed, but because the world moved on?
There's a photograph from 1938, taken in Brooklyn on a street near the Navy Yard. It shows an ice wagon pulled by a single horse. The wagon is half empty. The Iceman is sitting on the driver's bench, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. His face is turned away from the camera. Behind him, barely visible in the background, is a truck with the words City Ice and Fuel painted on the side. The truck has a refrigeration unit. It's motorized. It carries more ice than the wagon and delivers it faster. The man on the wagon isn't looking at the truck. He's looking at the street. No one is flagging him down. This is what the collapse looked like. The men who had spent their entire adult lives on the routes tried to adapt. Some of them transitioned to the motorized trucks. The companies preferred younger drivers, but if you had a good record and a loyal customer base, they might keep you on. The pay was better and the work was easier, but the routes were different. The truck covered more ground. The old neighborhood relationships didn't matter as much. And a lot of the older men couldn't drive. They had spent 20 years working with horses. The horse knew the route, and the horse stopped when it was supposed to stop. A truck required a license. It required coordination. It required a kind of attention that some of them just didn't have, so they were let go. The younger men took the truck routes. The older men took whatever was left, part-time shifts at the depot, loading and unloading, cleaning the storage rooms, jobs that paid half what they used to make and offered no stability. Some of them left the industry entirely. They became janitors, day laborers, night watchmen. They took whatever work they could find and tried not to think about the fact that they had once been essential. Their wives noticed the change first, not in what the men said, but in what they didn't say. A man who had come home every night for 20 years with stories about the route, about the families, the kids, the housewife who always tipped extra at Christmas, now came home silent. He ate dinner. He sat in the chair by the window. He stared at nothing.
The children noticed too. They noticed that their father's hands, which had always been rough and strong, now shook when he tried to button his shirt. They noticed that he walked slower, that he flinched when he bent down, that he didn't talk about work anymore, because there was no work to talk about. By 1942, the number of active ice delivery routes in major American cities had dropped by 70%. The depots that remained were servicing commercial accounts, restaurants, hospitals, markets. The residential routes were gone, and the men were gone with them. Some of them stayed in the trade as long as they could. There's a record of an iceman in South Philadelphia who was still making deliveries in 1947. He was 63 years old. He used a hand truck because he couldn't carry the blocks anymore. He delivered to 12 customers, all of them elderly, all of them too poor to afford a refrigerator. He worked until 1949. Then the last customer died, and there was no one left to deliver to. The unions tried to fight.
The Ice Drivers Union Local 743 filed complaints with the city. They argued that the companies had abandoned the workers without notice. They argued for severance, for pensions, for some kind of acknowledgement that these men had built the system and deserved something in return. The companies said the market had changed. They said it wasn't their fault. They said the men should have seen it coming. And maybe they should have. But how do you see the end of the world when you're carrying ice up a flight of stairs? The stories don't end cleanly. There's no final scene where the last Iceman hangs up his tongs and walks into the sunset. There's no moment of closure. There's just a slow unraveling. A man who stops showing up to the depot because there's no point. A wagon that sits in an alley until the wood rots. A pair of tongs rusting in a basement. And a generation of children who grow up never knowing that the refrigerator in the kitchen used to be a man's job. But some people remembered. Not the work, not the routes, not the wages. They remembered the sound, the clatter of the wagon, the thud of the ice being set down, the quiet moment when the Iceman tipped his cap and walked back out the door. That sound meant something once. What did it mean when it stopped?
There's a diner in Queens that's been open since 1952. It's a small place with chrome stools, a checkered floor, and a counter that runs the length of the room. They serve breakfast all day. In the back corner, near the kitchen, there's a black and white photograph on the wall. It shows a man standing next to a horse-drawn ice wagon. The man is young, maybe 30. He's wearing a cloth cap and a heavy apron. His sleeves are rolled up. He's holding a pair of tongs over his shoulder, and he's smiling. The owner of the diner is the man's grandson. He doesn't know much about the photograph. His father never talked about it. But he knows the man in the picture worked the ice routes in Long Island City for 18 years. He knows the wagon was sold in 1941. And he knows his grandfather spent the rest of his working life as a dock worker. He never went back to ice. The photograph is fading now. The edges are yellowed. The faces of the customers who sit beneath it don't look up at it anymore. It's just part of the wall. But it's still there, and that means something. Because the Iceman didn't disappear, not completely. He's still present in the design of the American kitchen. The refrigerator sits in the same spot the icebox used to sit, against the back wall near the door. The drip pan is gone, and the card in the window is gone, but the logic remains. Cold food, central location, daily access. The Iceman built that logic. He also built something else, a kind of trust. For 30 years, American families let a stranger walk into their home twice a week. They didn't lock the door. They didn't supervise. They just left the card in the window and went about their day. And the Iceman came in, did his job, and left. That trust didn't come from contracts or regulations. It came from repetition, from seeing the same man on the same day doing the same work year after year. It came from reliability. And when the Iceman was gone, that reliability didn't disappear. It transferred. The refrigerator became the new constant, the new thing you didn't have to think about, the new thing that just worked. But the refrigerator didn't have a face. It didn't know your name. It didn't nod at you when it walked up the stairs. It didn't toss ice chips to your children in the summer. It just hummed.
And maybe that was better. Maybe that was progress. Maybe the world is improved when we don't have to depend on another person's strong back and ruined knees to keep our food cold. But something was lost. Not the work, because the work was brutal. The work destroyed bodies. The work paid poorly and offered no future. What was lost was the presence, the sense that another person had been in your home, that they had touched something that mattered to you, that they had carried something heavy so you didn't have to.
The Iceman was a transaction, but he was also a witness. He saw how you lived. He saw your kitchen, your back porch, your children. He saw you at your most ordinary, and in a strange way that made him part of your life. When he stopped coming, the house didn't get quieter, it got emptier. There are still a few ice delivery companies operating in America. They service remote areas where electricity is unstable. They service disaster zones after hurricanes and floods. They service off-grid communities by choice or necessity. The drivers use trucks now. They wear company uniforms. They deliver in plastic bags, not blocks. But the work is the same. Heavy, repetitive, hard on the body, and invisible. Most people don't think about where their cold comes from. They open the refrigerator, take out the milk, and close the door. The motor kicks on, the temperature holds, the food stays fresh. It's automatic.
But it wasn't always. There was a time when cold was delivered by hand, when it arrived on a schedule, when it required a man with tongs and a tolerance for pain and a route he knew by heart. That time is over. But the men who lived it, who carried the weight, who climbed the stairs, who kept the city cold, they were real, and their work mattered, not because it was noble, not because it was romantic, but because it was necessary, and necessity, more than anything else, is what builds a life. The last ice wagon in Brooklyn was retired in 1958. It was bought by a man who turned it into a flower cart. He painted it yellow and wheeled it around Prospect Park on weekends, selling tulips and daisies to couples on dates. The cart is gone now. The man is gone. The park has changed. But for a while, the wagon that had carried ice through the streets of Brooklyn carried something else, something lighter, something that didn't melt. And maybe that's how it should have ended, not with an ending, but with a transformation, because nothing really disappears, it just becomes something else. And if you listen closely, on a quiet morning in an old neighborhood, when the streets are still empty, you can still hear it, the clatter of wheels on stone, the creak of wood under weight, the sound of a man doing his job. One more time.